Welcome back to Roots Music History. On this podcast, we talk about the stories behind songs and legends, as well as moments in history and history in the making. Dolly Parton was born as Dolly Rebecca Parton. She was the fourth born child to Robert Lee Parton Sr. and Avie Lee Caroline. They were so poor that when Dolly was born, they had to pay her midwife in the form of cornmeal. They paid lots of things in the form of goods or services versus money. Her father was a farmer who was one of 13 children. He was raised in the mountains of Tennessee in another very impoverished family, but also a very hard-working family. Now, her father never learned to read or write, but Dolly said he had the most business sense out of anyone she had ever met. And she will still say that to this day.
I got my business sense from my dad. I think I got that strength. If I slept with somebody, it's because I wanted to, not because I was trying to get ahead in business. It's like I was never like that.
Now, like I said, her family often would pay for things in the forms of goods or services, and the same went for their rent. When Dolly was born, her parents were renting out a farmhouse from a local landlord, and since they couldn't afford to pay their rent with money, the Partons would give their crops to their landlord so the landlord could sell them, and that was their form of rent payment. And while this seemed like a good deal for the Partons, if there was a season that had little to no rain, they would quickly become delinquent on their payments and in debt to their landlord, and they could even face eviction. And this was obviously very stressful for them and for her father especially. Her dad knew that this setup wasn't sustainable for the family. For the first few years of Dolly's life, the family just prayed every night for prosperity and an abundance of crops. And by the grace of God, those years were good to them. Good enough that not only could they afford to pay their rent in the form of crops, but they could also save up over these years to eventually buy their own farmhouse. In 1951, when Dolly was about 5 years old, her father decided to finally acquire his own land and the one-bedroom home that sat upon it. And Dolly's father and family would farm primarily tobacco crops and raise livestock. But the most important thing about Dolly's family purchasing this land was the fact that they were no longer dependent on seasonal weather to pay their rent. And with this new purchase of land, Dolly's father also started taking up construction jobs as a means of a more steady cash flow for him and the family. While this provided the family with a much stronger sense of financial stability, it also meant that her father was away and working from Monday morning all the way through Sunday night.
It's been really hard for you, Daddy, working in the fields. I remember most of my life. I remember seeing you down here in these fields and other fields and places where we lived. But you never did seem to complain or gripe about it.
Only thing I ever griped on you about when we was thinning the corn out, there'd be 3 stalks in the hill, and we'd pull the little stalk out, and I noticed you were pulling the big stalks out. I said, Dolly, don't do that.
While living in this one-bedroom farmhouse, Avie would go on to have 8 more children, each one serving a role on the farm and a role in serving the family. Avie took her role as a mother very seriously too. Not only did she always make sure the chores were tended to and there was a good meal on the table when Robert got home, she also made an active effort every evening to unwind with music and fun and happiness.
Remember how we used to sit here on this porch, all of us?
Oh, yeah, I was singing Young's and Cry.
Daddy always said you were the best singer of any of us in the whole bunch.
Well,
You still think that?
he done that so I wouldn't burn his cornbread.
In total, Dolly's mother, Avie, birthed 12 children by the time she was just 35 years old. And as you can imagine, this really started to take a toll on her health, especially as Avie embarked into her 40s and 50s. But despite any physical pain or health battles she was facing, she always pushed through for her family. And Dolly's father also played the fiddle. And one of Dolly's favorite memories growing up was when her father would come home from a long day's work or on a Sunday night especially, and take out the fiddle, and the whole family would sing and dance to his playing. Dolly's mother also made sure that all of the kids had a chance to sing in their local church, which is where Dolly first discovered her real love of performing. Now, I know I'm painting a picture of a house being super happy and full of music and problem-free, but the Parton family absolutely faced their fair share of challenges. One of the biggest day-to-day challenges for the Partons was their living arrangement. Like I said, the house they lived in was just a one-bedroom cottage with a front porch. One bedroom. for 12 children and 2 adults. Now, because of this, there would be multiple children in a bed at any given point in time. They all had to sleep together. And Dolly was quoted in Playboy in 1978 saying, quote, "The kids peed on me every night. We slept 3 and 4 kids in the bed. I would wash up the night before, get into bed, and sure enough, at some point in the night, I would get wet on again." But she said that sometimes the nights were so cold that it was almost nice to be peed on because it warmed her up and it warmed up the bed. But despite these challenging living conditions, Dolly's family loved each other deeply, and Dolly loved and found so much pride in performing for her family. It wasn't just her parents and siblings she'd perform for either. She'd perform for any living being that would listen. The chickens, the dogs, and of course, anytime her uncles and aunts and cousins came over for family dinner, she would perform for all of them too. And one of her uncles particularly really supported Dolly's dream and saw something in Dolly, that spark that he just had to support and pursue with her. So one day, that uncle, whose name was Bill Owens, brought Dolly an old mandolin and 2 bass guitar strings. Dolly was ecstatic and couldn't wait to use this for her home concerts. She put the old bass strings on the mandolin and then took a stick and tied a tin can to the end of the stick to use as a microphone. Dolly performed with this makeshift guitar and microphone for about a year. And then when Dolly was 8 years old, that same uncle, Uncle Bill, gave her her very first guitar. And Dolly immediately proved to everyone she was a born artist. Although Dolly loved to play and daydream about performing in front of large crowds, she woke up every day with the responsibility of 1, getting an education, and 2, contributing her fair share of help to the household. Now, back then, it was expected that the older children in the family assist in household chores and also take care of the younger children when the mother was doing laundry or cooking or something that prohibited her from rocking a baby or changing a diaper. In fact, back then, it was very common, especially with these families that were having 10 to 12 children, that the mothers would often assign a newborn baby to one of the older children. And then that older child would act as a mother's helper to that one baby throughout the entirety of that child's infancy and developmental years. When Dolly was 9 years old, her mother had another baby, a baby boy named Larry. And Dolly was finally old enough to be assigned to Larry as a mother's helper. Now, this meant it would be Dolly's duty to make sure the baby was always fed and changed and to rock the baby while her mother took care of other necessary chores around the house. And then, as the baby became a toddler, it would be Dolly's job to babysit that one baby, make sure they didn't get into anything or eat anything they shouldn't eat, anything like that. And Dolly was over the moon about being given this responsibility. She took it really seriously. Tragically, when Larry was still a newborn, he suddenly passed away. And this really impacted Dolly. It's something she's talked about in interviews for years and years and years. And in fact, I believe that it was Larry's death that actually led her to her big break in music. I think Larry's death, in a way, was her first divine music intervention moment.
Well, the one that Mama lost was going to be my baby, and I was so excited. And anyway, it was just it just crushed me, and it crushed my mom too, just losing a child. But anyway, that little baby died, the one that was supposed to be mine, and that's one of the big parts of the...
You named the baby too, Larry. Yeah, you named baby Larry. You made...
Not even a full year after Larry's passing, a remarkable opportunity landed in Dolly's lap. Dolly's Uncle Bill, the same one who got her her first guitars, knew about a local radio personality in town named... Drum roll, please. Cass Walker. Cass Walker was a self-made millionaire operating out of Knoxville, Tennessee. He was running a variety show called Farm and Home Hour. The segment was initially meant, and its main purpose was, to promote his chain of grocery stores. And it would feature all sorts of artists like Roy Acuff, Jimmy Martin, Carl Smith, Chet Atkins, and so many more. Dolly's Uncle Bill was so impressed with Dolly's singing and love of performance performing. And then he saw that spark in Dolly disappear when her baby brother Larry passed away. He saw how hard Larry's death was on Dolly and on her mother. And he knew the family needed a pick-me-up, something to be inspired about again. So Uncle Bill pulled a few strings and ended up getting Dolly backstage on the live radio program. Anyone who knows Dolly knows she is determined. She is a businesswoman. She is bold. She is fearless. She will just go right on up and do what she needs to do to try to network and get her name out there. So in true Dolly fashion, at 10 years old, she's backstage at this radio station. She walked straight up to Cass Walker and told him straight to his face that she wanted to work for him. Cass Walker was supposedly so impressed with her bold initiative, he didn't just invite her back to the radio station. He invited her back to the radio station to sing live on the radio during his next Farm and Home Hour segment.
Right now, here's our youngest singing sensation here on the Cass Walker program, little Dolly Parton. Dolly? What you singing, Dolly?
I gotta go.
And not just that, he also landed her a television gig, which was huge for the Partons because the Parton family didn't even own a television. Dolly sang on this segment like a total professional, and after she sang her last note, everyone who was in the room at the radio station erupted in cheers and claps for this little girl. Soon enough, everyone in town recognized Dolly's voice and recognized Dolly as that little local girl who could sing. A couple years later, it was 1959 when Dolly Parton, with the help of her Uncle Bill Owens, made her very first official recording in a real studio setting. This recording was a song called Puppy Love, and this was Dolly's first official single. Dolly was only about 12 or 13 years old at this time. Now, like I mentioned, Carl Smith was a regular on the Cass Walker show. When Uncle Bill and Dolly were backstage at this radio station, they connected with a few people who knew Carl Smith personally. Carl Smith at the time was also the host for the Grand Ole Opry. And through the connections made here at the radio station, Dolly and Uncle Bill landed themselves a guest spot at the Opry. While at the Grand Ole Opry, Dolly Parton actually saw Johnny Cash, and she joked that she had a huge crush on Johnny, but obviously he was a little bit too old for her. I have to go back and check, but I think the night Dolly Parton had that guest spot, and I could be wrong about this because it could have been another night, but I think the night Dolly Parton had this guest spot on the Grand Ole Opry was the night June Carter met Johnny Cash backstage. Because if you haven't watched my Roots documentary on the love story between Johnny and June, I talk about this in that episode, but June was married to Carl Smith and was pregnant with Carl Smith's baby when Carl Smith introduced a man named Johnny Cash onto the stage, and June met Johnny while she was pregnant with Carl's baby, ended up leaving Carl for Johnny Cash. And if you look at photographs of Carl Smith and Johnny Cash next to each other, they look almost exactly alike, which is very awkward to me. June definitely had a type. I mean, I get it. Listen, if you're going to have a type, might as well have it be the Johnny Cash, Carl Smith type because, oof, I get it. Just a little awkward piece of music history trivia there. And I think it was 1959. So I think it could have been that night Dolly was there, but I'll go back and check and I'll put on the screen if I'm right or if I'm wrong. Now, as divine music intervention would have it, there was a man at the Grand Ole Opry that night, not Johnny Cash, but another man named Porter Wagner. Porter was really good friends with Carl Smith. He had written several songs for Carl, so Porter was a total veteran in the music industry. The complete opposite of Dolly, who is coming onto the stage with just starstruck, giddy eyes. But had Porter not been there that night Dolly was playing, Dolly and Porter might not have ever met. And meeting Porter Wagoner ended up being life-changing for Dolly. Dolly was 13 years old when she met Porter, and Porter was 32. Despite everything seeming to fall in place for Dolly at such a young age, she was still determined to get her education. She made a point to wait and finish high school before moving to Nashville, Tennessee at the age of 16. Dolly moved to Nashville with her uncle Bill Owens, who was now acting as Dolly's manager, and the two immediately began working to get Dolly signed. In 1962, they succeeded when Dolly was signed to Tree Publishing and Mercury Records. However, just 1 year into her contracts with Tree and Mercury, Dolly Parton was dropped from the label because none of her songs were charting. But Dolly was not going to quit. In 1963, she signed with Somerset Records. She released a compilation album that featured Faye Tucker, and that album did pretty well. While this was going really well for Dolly, and it was giving her some kind of traction in the industry, she wasn't completely satisfied though. She really wanted to write and release her own music as an independent artist. That was always her ultimate goal. And then just a few years later, in 1965, her dream came true when Monument Records decided to sign her as an independent artist. And this was everything Dolly had ever wanted and had been working for since she moved to Music City in 1962. Around the same time Dolly got signed to Monument, she was standing outside the Wishy Washy laundromat in Nashville, Tennessee, when a 21-year-old hunk drove by in a pickup truck and whistled at her. If you've ever been to Nashville, Tennessee, there are so many hunks driving around in pickup trucks. It's heaven. Well, this hunk's name was Carl Dean. Carl Dean and Dolly exchanged information right there in front of the Wishy Washy. And Carl said he knew when he first saw her that she was the one. He said he couldn't take his eyes off of her. And Dolly's love life wasn't the only thing taking off in this year. Her music career was also really starting to rev up. Through Monument, she released 2 singles that charted almost right away on the Billboard country charts. Dumb Blonde, which peaked at number 24, and Something Fishy, which peaked at number 17. 1 year after the success of these songs, Dolly and Carl Dean got married. And it was in September of that same year Porter Wagoner asked Dolly Parton if she'd like to make an appearance on The Porter Wagoner Show and sing a duet with him. The crowd's response to this duet on the show was incredible. Dolly also had a blast on the show, and she and Porter seemed to get along really well. So it wasn't long after that first duet together, Porter asked Dolly if she'd come on the show full time. Now, while you might look at Dolly and think her big break came when she was 13 years old at the Ryman Auditorium, singing at the Grand Ole Opry, it's arguably true that her big break didn't really come until this debut on the Porter Wagoner Show. She did have singles when she was on the show, and they were doing well. They weren't doing badly. But being on the Porter Wagoner Show consistently brought Dolly into the homes and living rooms of every American, and Americans were able to bond with her and with her music in ways they never would have been able to had she only focused on releasing albums. Dolly would spend the next 7 years of her 20s working on the Porter Wagoner Show. The show almost always featured a duet between Dolly and Porter, followed by some kind of a comedic guest, and then it would always end with some sort of a gospel song. Now, in these 7 years, while Dolly was between the ages of about 21 to 28 years old, she and Porter not only worked on the show on a consistent basis, but they also released 13 albums and had 14 top 10 hits. Porter was also Dolly's producer on a lot of her solo albums. This was really important to Dolly to make solo albums because being a solo independent artist was the heart and soul of Dolly Parton. By the time Dolly was 28 years old, she really felt in her heart that her chapter on the Porter Wagoner Show was coming to an end. She began to feel like staying on the show would hold her back from pursuing her solo career. So in 1974, Dolly broke the news to Porter that she was leaving the show. Up until this point, throughout all of Dolly's 20s, Porter controlled a lot of aspects of Dolly's life. I also think the idea of Dolly leaving really scared Porter. I think he and everyone else on the show was kind of thinking the same thing. Like, if Dolly leaves, are people still going to tune in? Like, what does the future of the Porter Wagoner show look like without Dolly Parton? So Porter kind of began to panic, and he started going on TV shows and radio programs, doing interviews, completely trash talking Dolly.
To me, Dolly Parton is the kind of person that I would never trust with anything of mine. I mean, her family, her own blood, she would turn her back on to help herself. I'm not that kind of person. I don't care about talking about it because most people would think I'm bitter. You know, Dolly, I'm not bitter at her at all.
She knew leaving the show was something she had to do for her career, but she also saw clearly how hurt and scared this was making Porter Wagoner. Dolly never said a bad word about Porter. In fact, not only did Dolly not say anything bad about Porter Wagoner, she actually turned around and wrote him a song called I Will Always Love You. Now, before Dolly ever gave this song to her record label, before anyone heard it, Dolly took it to Porter Wagoner first, and she said, "This is for you." She was like, "Of course, I'm going to give it to the label. It's actually pretty good, but I wrote it for you, and I want you to hear it first." Porter admitted he was very humbled and honored that she wrote this, and for a while after Dolly wrote this song for him, she and Porter had a period of peace. 1 year later, the song was released and started doing really well. I think better than Dolly ever could have imagined it would do. Within just a few months of being released, the song was #1 on Billboard. This song became so huge that Elvis Presley even entered the chat, and Elvis wanted to do a cover of the song. Dolly remembers her team calling her and saying, "Hey, Elvis wants to do a cover of your song." She remembers this like it was yesterday. And Elvis's team was saying to her team, "Yeah, just come on by the studio whenever, doesn't matter." Had a very chill, laid-back attitude about this whole thing. They said, "Anytime works, don't worry about anything, we'll take care of everything." And Dolly was really excited that Elvis Presley was going to cover her song. And then the night before they were scheduled to go into the studio for this cover, Elvis's manager called Dolly and said, "Oh, by the way, one more quick thing. We don't do anything like this unless we get half of the publishing rights." Just a side note. And Dolly was like, "You want half of the publishing rights?" She knew she could not give away half of the rights to this song. This song was her baby. It was her whole life. It was everything she had been working for, everything her whole career had led up to was this song, I Will Always Love You. So obviously, Dolly pushed back on that, and Elvis's team just walked away. But Elvis continued to love this song, so much so that when he and Priscilla got their divorce, as they were walking out of the courtroom, Elvis stopped Priscilla on the steps of the courthouse and sang her, I Will Always Love You. And during this time frame, Dolly released another single called Jolene. Jolene was also the name of the album. Side 1 was Jolene, side 2 was I Will Always Love You. And Dolly jokes because the song Jolene was actually written and inspired by a bank teller who had a huge crush on her husband, Carl Dean. And for the longest time, it was such a joke between Dolly and Carl because Carl would go to the bank and this bank teller would just be like googly-eyed over Carl. Carl started coming home and joking that he loved going to the bank because this woman was just pumping up his tires so much every time. So Dolly had this idea in the back of her head for this song, like, please don't take my man, you know, but she didn't have a name for the girl, and she was kind of struggling in that writing process, but the song was always kind of on the back burner. Until one day, Dolly was signing autographs. She went to sign an autograph for a little girl, and she said, "Okay, darling, and what's your name?" And the little girl said, "Jolene." And Dolly said, "Jolene?" She said, "I love the name Jolene." And then she looked at her and said, "Don't be surprised if you hear that in a song." Dolly went home, put the name Jolene on that song inspired by the bank teller, and that is how the song Jolene was born. A lot of people took the song Jolene seriously because a lot of people are in this situation with another woman trying to take their man, but for Dolly and Carl, this song was always lighthearted, very innocent, and comical to them. And the album Jolene, that featured I Will Always Love You, went platinum not once, not twice, but a total of 3 times in the US alone. Now, Porter Wagoner, meanwhile, is watching all of this success, and he is fuming. He is not taking this well. He's getting a little jealous to say the least. He does not like seeing Dolly do so well without him. So Porter decided he would insist that he was entitled to 15% of Dolly's total net income from June 1974 through June of 1979, and an additional 15% from all of her records royalties for all of her songs during all of those years. Oh, and future royalties too. And that's not all. He also sought an additional $2 million for what he called was a future loss of income. I mean, this lawsuit that Porter brought on to her in 1979 was brutal. Now, Dolly, when she was hit with this, definitely did not want to go to court. She wanted to settle this outside of a courthouse, like Johnny Depp originally wanted to do with Amber Heard. Team Johnny. So Dolly and Porter did ultimately make a settlement. Dolly told Porter that she would give him the first $1 million she made. She also promised Porter that they could make one more album together. Now, everyone started buzzing about this because many people thought it was just a rumor. I mean, there was no way people thought Dolly and Porter, after all of these legal headaches, would have the kind of relationship where they could go in and work on another album together. And people were not entirely wrong. This might have ended up being the most awkward album in music history. Their duet album was ultimately released on August 4th, 1980, but the album definitely wasn't done entirely out of love. I'll put it that way. For starters, the album was simply called Porter and Dolly, period. I'm just kidding. But it was just Porter and Dolly. And note, Porter first, Dolly second. Dolly and Porter were really not even on speaking terms when this album got released, and the majority of the album was done. In fact, it might have been the entirety of the album, but at the very least, the majority of it was done while Dolly and Porter were in completely separate locations from each other. Even the album cover was photoshopped to make it look like Dolly and Porter were standing side by side together, but they were 2 completely separate photographs just pasted together. I can't tell this part of the story without laughing because it's so awkward. Now, to make this album even more funny, the 2 singles that ended up peaking on the charts was number 1, called Making Plans, that peaked at number 2, and If You Go, I'll Follow You, which peaked at number 12. Both somewhat metaphorically odd to me. After Porter got this album and got $1 million, Dolly could now focus on herself and her career again. And she would go on to make far more than $1 million, mind you. After reaching a certain point of success, Dolly decided to start putting a lot of her profits into charities that meant a lot to her. And she didn't want to just mindlessly dump money in charities either. She wanted to be hands-on with them and make sure the money was actually going to good use. In 1988, she launched the Dollywood Foundation to fund local improvements in her hometown. And through this foundation, a buddy program was also formed, which offered $500 to high school graduates to help them with book expenses or any other expense related to graduating. This $500 graduation program alone ended up decreasing the dropout rate in the local high schools from 35% to 6%. And then in 1986, Dolly joined forces with a theme park that had been operating out of Knoxville, Tennessee. She took over a large majority of ownership in this theme park and then rebranded the park to be called Dollywood. And then it wasn't until 11 years later, after she started doing all of this work in the community, that Kevin Costner's team approached Dolly's team and said they were making a little movie called The Bodyguard. Kevin Costner had heard the song I Will Always Love You by Dolly Parton and wanted to bring that song to the music producers on the movie for Whitney Houston to sing as part of the film. Dolly was very excited about this possibility, and at this point in her career, she had a team to handle all of the licensing and publishing rights and all of that red tape. You know, she was never going to be in another situation where Elvis Presley or anyone else could potentially take 50% of the publishing rights. That wasn't going to happen. So now they just had proper licensing, proper controls, and she pretty much handed off everything to her team to do all of the communicating with Kevin Costner and with the Bodyguard producers. So the team sent the movie producers the song I Will Always Love You and the license rights and all of that, and then they didn't hear anything. Now, as Kevin explains, he even wasn't sure if they were going to use the song either. He said he got the file from her and he gave it to the production team, but things kind of went quiet. So he kept following up with the production team and with Arista Records, who was working directly with everyone. And apparently, the music production team had another song they really wanted to use for the movie. And they were actually starting to move forward with that other song when Kevin Costner stepped in and really made a stink. At one point, Arista and the producers said, okay, fine, we'll have Whitney try it out. Hey, Whitney, you want to try out this song? Hey, Whitney, just want to try out this song that's going to change the world forever? Give it a whack? I can't even imagine that moment when Whitney first started to sing the song. I would have given anything to have been there. Whitney opened her mouth and started to sing the song, and everyone just kind of looked at each other, looked at Kevin Costner and thought, this is gold.
We had picked another song, What Becomes of a Broken Heart, but it had been used a year earlier, and when we saw that it came out in another movie, we decided we didn't want to muddy the water, and we knew we had to find another song, and 3 songs came to me, and a bunch of songs were submitted, and I'd always loved that song, Dolly's song, and I thought it was really right, and convincing the other side wasn't the easiest conversation, a little country song. You know, in retrospect, everybody's really happy how the song turned out, but I think I forensically know where the bones are in a lot of it. And that song was, I think even from Whitney, like, well, what do you give me a Dolly Parton song for? I said, you know, our relationship was, just be quiet, try to sing it, okay? And she'd always would laugh over something like that. But I felt a cappella was important because when you, from the movie standpoint, I didn't pick the song because I was thinking what it was going to become. I just picked the song because I thought emotionally was right there. And when you want to tell somebody that you love them in song, there's no braver way to do it than without music. There's a subconscious thing that goes, wow, this person's going to make sure I hear every word. They're not going to cloud it with this or that. It's like I'm making a statement. And so for me, the statement a cappella was very important for the movie. When they began to think about, you know, record play, that was like, well, you're not going to be able to use this. They're going to want to just lop this off. And my answer on that was really simple. It's the same way when people talk to me about, do you want to get an airplane version of your film? My response has always been, I don't give a shit if it ever plays on the airplane. I don't want to see it torn up. And so the radio might not play I Will Always Love You because it starts that way. I remember saying, absolutely, don't be so sure. I wouldn't be too sure about that.
And the funniest part about all of this, of course, is that not only did the song make it on the radio, it ended up being the most popular song on the radio, arguably because it begins a cappella. Now, meanwhile, Dolly Parton had no idea any of this was going on.
I was driving from my office down on 16th Avenue on Music Row. I was driving to my house in Brentwood. And that's when I was still driving by myself without worrying about it. And so I had the radio on as usual. And I just heard this voice when she did the a cappella, you know, like, if I should stay. And you know, it's like a dog that hears its name or something. I thought, what is that? And it didn't register on me, but it was so familiar. And I thought, what is that? And then she kept saying, and it was still, I knew it was something, but it didn't register. I thought, what is that? I know what that is. And then all of a sudden, she starts into that, and when she goes into the I will always love you part, honest to goodness, I almost wrecked. I had to pull over because I was afraid, because I was so caught up in that by then.
Right.
That I had to pull over and listen to it, but it was the most overwhelming feeling that little song of mine could be done so beautifully.
The song I Will Always Love You remains one of the top 5 best-selling songs worldwide to this day. It has sold over 20 million copies and has won 2 Grammys. In 1995, inspired by her father, who never learned how to read or write, Dolly Parton, through the Dollywood Foundation, launched another charity called the Imagination Library. She initially started it just for her local area for children who couldn't afford books, but it now spans over 5 countries and gifts over 2 million free books each month to children around the world. She's also got a dinner theater, a line of dog clothing, baking mixes, cookware, and now recently, as recent as 2024, she has announced she is launching a wine line, a line of wine. Apparently, these wines are going to be made through a collaboration between the Parton family cellars and Accolade Wines. And Accolade Wines has, I think, over 50 different brands of wine. Dolly's first wine will be a California Chardonnay, which my mother will be very excited about. After the Chardonnay is launched, Dolly then plans to add a rosé and a Prosecco in the fall, which I'm very excited for the Prosecco. I think, though, the rosé and Prosecco will be focused on the UK. I'm not totally sure about that. Don't quote me on that. But despite Dolly's incredible business sense and business savvy, I think my favorite trait of Dolly Parton is her faith in God and in God's plan. I'm so excited that I was able to bring my favorite stories to you this week. If you have any favorite memories of Dolly Parton, please include them in the comments down below. And if you like this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the thumbs up button. And thank you so much for being here and being part of the Roots Music History family. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.